everyone, and welcome back to another book review. Today I am reviewing Saints in Medieval Manuscripts by Greg Buzwell. This is an entry in the series Medieval Life in Manuscripts. I have read 3 other books in this series: Magic in Medieval Manuscripts, Astrology in Medieval Manuscripts, and Monsters and Grotesques in Medieval Manuscripts. All of those reviews are on my channel if you want to check them out, so I am familiar with this series. The series is quite short. They're designed to be introductions to topics. This book is just around 60 pages, and as a result, it tends to be very, very high level. The series takes a topic, in this case the saints, but in the other books mentioned, astrology or magic, and says, what can we learn about medieval life from manuscripts? Primarily art. What in the art of medieval manuscripts can we learn about this topic, saints? And as we know from the medieval era in Europe, the Catholic Church and Christianity was very, very strong. It was a very strong force in both daily life and also large-scale political things. So it makes sense that saints, a feature of the Christian faith, would feature quite prominently in medieval texts. The book, as mentioned, is only 60 pages, so I'm going to give you a brief introduction on what you can expect to find in this book, as well as the parts of this book that were most interesting to me. So let's dive in and talk about what is in this book. The first section is Introduction, Saints in the Medieval World. I've already kind of touched on the importance of the Catholic Church in the medieval world, particularly in Europe, but also the importance of saints in people's personal lives. Saints could intercede between the person who is praying and God, so they had a very important role. And there is quite a bit of art that has been found or is in medieval texts that feature saints, because religion at this time was also very, very visual. So we have many depictions of saints, and we'll get on to how many of these survived in the very last section. So the first section, and again, this can truly only be high level, is just an introduction to saints in the medieval world. We then move into specific categories of saints. The author of this book touches on martyrs, so those who were killed for their faith. And he mentions that usually the saints that are martyred are featured with the means by which they were martyred. For example, this one killed by arrows, so that there's a quick visual reference and the person who's looking at this can know exactly which saint they're being referenced. They're followed by another category, which is more of a subset of martyrs, the virgin martyrs, which were held in, I guess, particular esteem. And we, of course, have very specific imagery associated with each of these. So this is the saint it was Saint Catherine, who is supposed to be killed on this wheel or broken on this wheel, and she's usually featured with that. So another easy visual reference for the viewer to see which saint they're talking about. But there is a whole section specifically devoted to the virgin martyrs as a subset of the martyrs themselves. Next, we have confessor saints, and this was honestly a category I hadn't heard of before, so I was glad it was introduced. Confessor saints were saints that were not killed for their faith, but were considered living a good example of the Christian faith, and therefore were canonized, and these were called the confessor saints. And we have various examples. I think this is Saint Jerome. Yes, Saint Jerome here is a great example, and you can see the beautiful art on this page, so definitely take your time to look at the art in the book. The art really features just as heavily as the text. So we have the confessor saints. And those are the 3 specific categories of saints that are talked about, because then we move into canonization. And canonization is the process by which a person who has died becomes a saint in the Catholic faith. Now, this is a process, I personally am not Catholic, but this is a process that I believe is still ongoing today. So saints are still canonized today, but this kind of started as a very informal process and was formalized throughout the medieval era. And that is what is discussed here. There's a section discussing how saints can become canonized. It is quite short, but it is important to discuss how these individuals who previously were just regular Christians, or maybe exemplary Christians, is that a word? Outstanding Christians, who then became elevated to this level of sainthood through the canonization process. Next, we have one of my favorite sections, the role of saints, relics, and pilgrimages. So these were important ways in which practicing Christians in the medieval world could interact with the saints. So the role of saints in intercession, or we also have relics, so maybe the bones of saints, and pilgrimages, which would be journeys you could undertake. The pilgrimage, and of course, relics are not unique. These features are not unique to Christianity, but this is just their role in the medieval world, so we're really dialing in. And again, it's a very expansive topic. The role of saints, relics, and pilgrimages could probably fill a 500-page book, but in this case, we're confined to a couple pages just due to the size. Although this section is quite extensive, larger than the other sections, and I think truly that's due to the importance that these things like relics and pilgrimages took on in the medieval world. This is an example of Canterbury Tales. If you're familiar with that, that was part of a pilgrimage, although how repentant the pilgrims in Canterbury Tales are is up to debate. Next was a section I'm not entirely sure why it was included, maybe the author's specialty or a location of a large number of manuscripts. However, it was one of my favorite sections, Saints of the British Isles. So they specifically focused in on the British Isles and talked about distinct saints from that section. So definitely don't skip this. I'm not sure if they just wanted a geographic focus for one particular section to talk about specific saints or if there was another reason why this was chosen, but I really did like this section. We have some full pages of art to look at. This was was Cuthbert teaching at Lindisfarne. I hope I'm saying that correctly. And then of course his body found to be incorruptible or incorrupt and therefore a sure sign of sainthood. But this is just beautiful art if you want to take some time to look at it and really appreciate the skill and the distinctive style of these medieval pieces of art. And the second to last section, image of saints in the medieval world. The religious life of the Middle Ages was quite visual. So we have an example of the medieval world and the saints therein in this section. Just another area to focus on the fantastic art that we can see. And the final section, which is the Reformation. So the Reformation, although there were some lead-ups to Martin Luther, really started with Martin Luther, and that was a massive change in the way Christianity was practiced in Europe. It fundamentally has changed a lot of things about the Christian faith and the role of the Catholic Church in Europe, of course, at that point has splintered into areas that were still practicing Catholic and those that were Protestant regions. I know there was I remember in my German history class looking at many maps showing the variation of different Catholic or Protestant practices. And the Reformation really initially was kind of started as there may be things we need to change within the Catholic Church. I knew there were a lot of things that the people who started the Reformation disagreed with, but it quickly became a full split from the Catholic Church, kind of spun off into its own thing. And part of this was no longer wanting to have saints, which were maybe viewed as having too high of a role in the Catholic Church by people who were pushing forward the Reformation. I'm deeply simplifying things right now. But there was some destruction of representations of saints. So the fact that we have some that survive is, I don't want to say a miracle because there were areas that never ceased to become practicing Catholic areas, but there was definitely a destruction of some images and some artwork during the Reformation, and that is impacted the amount that is available for us today. So the Reformation is kind of tying up the end. It is kind of also one of the ending points of the Middle Ages. It's something that comes at the end of the Middle Ages. It kind of ushers in a new era. So the complete dominance and the complete control of the Catholic Church is kind of broken at that point. And it's a massive change. The Reformation is a massive change in Europe. So it's a natural ending point to this book to end on the Reformation. Now I want to talk about some things that were interesting. Obviously, this book is not comprehensive by any stretch of the imagination, and when I go into smaller books like this, I try to view the book as a springboard. What topics in this book can I find interesting to read about further? So that's where that section on the British Isles came in. I felt like that section to me was just interesting, and so I definitely want to look through that section again and find topics that I may want to read about in longer, more comprehensive books. Another section I really enjoyed, and I'm going to call out in particular, page 33, is the relics section. So relics very quickly became financially profitable for a church to have. If you had relics, you had pilgrims. If you had pilgrims, you had an increase in trade. Fantastic. But you can quickly see when there's money, there quickly becomes the incentive to do less than legal or moral things to get that money. That's been a universal throughout human history. It's not just the Catholic Church and relics. That is definitely not the only example of people doing unethical things for money. So in that section on page 33 and moving into 34, there were people who would pretend to kiss relic bones, but but they'd actually bite off a section. So they would have a piece of the bone that they could show off at their church, then becoming a destination for pilgrims. There was another story in which some people were looking for relics and they thought, oh, there's a particularly pious hermit who lives out of the city. Let's kill him, and then he's a martyr, and then we can have his bones turned into relics. So there was a lot of shady shenanigans going on to get relics, and that makes sense. I've also heard, this was not in this book, but the number of pieces of the true cross that were purported to exist would greatly exceed the actual true cross. So, and that makes sense. Another example given was Thomas Becket, who was killed and immediately brought to this high level. This was in England, a very, very famous example. He was Archbishop of Canterbury, killed, canonized, and there was this scheme running about an endless supply of the martyr's blood, which questionable. Another example of questionable means to get relics, but you can sell the martyr's blood for money, which must have made the local Catholic Church very, very happy to have that. So the whole section on relics and financial gain around, I feel like I could read a 250-page book of all the shady practices and interesting practices and unique practices that happened around that. Another section that was really interesting to me was the importance that visual images would play in the religious life. Obviously, illiteracy was high, so I can imagine that was a part of it. Many people not being literate, although I imagine people who weren't literate also wouldn't have access to books, but they may have access to images within churches, which they could easily identify as maybe different stories. But even those who were literate, if you had access to a book, there would be a saint with one particular item, and that item would remind you of the story that you were supposed to remember. So it was kind of a visual shorthand for the story that the artist wanted you to remember, and the visual shorthand also helped you identify the saint in the picture. This is a tie-in with another book that I've read that, if I remember, I will link at the end of this video, Faces of Power and Piety, in another series called the Medieval Imagination series, where the author goes in depth on how portraits and pictures and people were depicted in the Middle Ages, and a key part of that was depicting saints with items that they were associated with as a visual shorthand to tell the reader or the viewer who that saint was, and I felt like that was a very close tie-in. I think if you're reading this book, the way you should view it, again, is not as a comprehensive overview, but as a springboard. You're going to be introduced to a wide variety of topics, and you should find what looks interesting to you. So you should peruse it, and then find what looks interesting to you and use that as a springboard for a more in-depth book on what you want to read. That is how I would recommend reading Saints in Medieval Manuscripts, although let me know what you think. If you've read this book, what did you think? What did you enjoy? How did you read it? Did you view it as a springboard, maybe as an introduction or a starter book to get you into the series? I would love to know how you approach this book. Please let me know in the comment section down below. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.